we're fortunate in the theme of connecting with the wider community to have Duncan Burt from National Grid here, who's going to tell us about some of the problems that National Grid facing dealing with capacity expansion under uncertainty.
Thanks, Andy, and very good afternoon, everybody. Andy said, please don't worry about not having any maths in your presentation. Just give us the problem and we'll work with you on that. So this is very straightforward and very simple. I feel almost embarrassed. But let me set some context. So I'm going to talk to you this morning about actually the title, it's about making choices in the development of the UK power grid. Now, the UK power grid is a 50 gigawatt peak system at the moment. If you go back 10 years, we thought it would be about a 65, 70 gigawatt peak system by now. But hey, things go the other way sometimes, yeah? So we had a lot of growth of distributed generation. We've seen a lot of management away from the peak. So actually the system now is about 20, 30% smaller than we thought it would be when we were forecasting 10 years ago. And that's very pertinent to making choices about how to develop the future power grid, because some of your simple big numbers can be really, really wrong. And what we're going to talk about here is something called the NOAA process, the Network Options Analysis process. And in the day-to-day operation of UK electricity markets, the more important a subject is, the more boring its title is. It's a general rule which I find holds firm for pretty much everything. The reverse is true in crisis management. So the NOAA process is the process that we're using as the newly forming separate ESO to decide how and what investments should be made to develop the grid to respond to the potential choices that the market are going to make in terms of connections, the potential development of demand behaviour and of society more generally. And we're trying to do that for all of the potential investments that could be made to improve the grid. And I'll talk through how we do all of that. But you can think of this process as effectively, well, the ESO, we're acting as the commissioners of the network. Yeah, we're not building it, that's done by the transmission owners. We are deciding what we think needs to be delivered in terms of capability, and then asking others or our own teams to go and deliver and manage that. So I'll talk about some of the constraints in this. I'm not going to talk for very long, Andy, and then we hopefully can have a good discussion. So I've taken the view that less is more, and you'll ask me questions about where you want. So like everything we do in the ESO, this is a risk management exercise, plain and simple. It's nothing else. When we make choices on investment, an investment could be old school investment in assets. Much more likely these days it is investment in control techniques, very light to implement smart technology, or more detailed smart control schemes which allow us to control flow on the grid using both demand side, storage options and other things to offset what would have been a traditional need for a heavy asset investment. If we get this NOAA process wrong, then first and foremost we've probably driven higher costs into customer bills if we've oversized. Someone is going to get a return on assets disallowed potentially because they'll have backed our plan. And we've also probably delivered some unneeded infrastructure in some cases, so they've had significant environmental impact. And actually, as fundamental as the Environmental Act, we'll have lost public confidence in important processes such as the planning and consent process, which is in itself an incredibly expensive hidden cost within the choices that we're making. If we underinvest, we're very likely to be failing against our own quality of supply standards. We will impinge on that in some ways. We'll have pushed up our congestion and other costs of operating the network day to day. They currently sit at about £1 billion a year. We'll have impacted the wholesale market because we will be taking additional actions and that will pollute the cleanness of the wholesale market and reduce competition because people won't be able to trade so clearly because we'll be getting in the way as the ESO. And most importantly, we'll have made the system more complex, harder to manage, And in doing that, we will have put a number of layers of complexity and risk into the system which add to system failure risk. So if we overinvest, it gets more expensive and people lose trust in our process. If we underinvest, we make our own lives more complicated and we add risk to shutting the power grid down. It is no wonder that internationally regulators suspect that many operators in the world go to this side, or try and avoid this side by going to this side. Most of these risks do not fall on the organisation and the bureaucracy. Most of these risks do. Our aim is to try and be really transparent about how we're making those choices and push ourselves incredibly hard to make sure that we're balancing those two things really effectively. Whether you believe me or not is your own choice. Okay. A little bit more detail on that as to what factors are coming into play and are driving the uncertainties that we're making. And perhaps before I go too much further, I should scale it as well. the GB system's a 50 gigawatt system. We sit with between 50 and 90 gigawatts of new connection applications over the next 15, 20 years. So the number of applications we have for connection of supply and storage are more than the current peak demand. So it's a very wide field of uncertainty. Those range from large nuclear power stations to very big offshore wind farms to very significant regional growth of embedded generation, both renewable and non-renewable peaking. The vast majority of renewable connections in the UK are wind in Scotland, which contains about 20% of all of the wind capability in Europe in terms of raw wind resource. And in the south, it is still sunny in the south of England. I know many of you won't believe that, but in the south, quite significant amounts of solar coming on as well. And in fact, whilst we've had a 10-year discussion over Hinkley C, more solar than the capacity of Hinkley Point C has connected in the southwest of England. So these things are just slipping away quite quietly in the background. But big uncertainty is all of those new connections drive into how the grid might develop, the power transfers that they create, and the system operability challenges that will come with that. More renewables and less synchronous generation means a much lighter grid, which many commentators would say is riskier, more volatile and harder to operate. We would just say that it's different, and actually it's a bit more like driving a sports car rather than driving a train. So if you put a train driver in charge of a sports car, they'll probably crash it, but if actually you carefully step through that process, a sports car gives you a lot more flexibility than your traditional coal and gas and nuclear based large thermal system. So we quite like res systems, we're just getting used to running them. On the other side, we have obviously the massive driver of decarbonisation, which isn't in itself really an uncertainty these days, but is the speed that you're travelling at, which can change significantly. The political landscape, which I will say no more about this week in the UK, network flows and how they might change with changes in demand behaviour and other things that we'll put on top of that to control flow, and incredible potential shifts in technology. And if I'd been standing here 5 years ago, we'd have been having a very academic conversation about whether batteries were going to be valuable in 10 years' time. Actually 4 years ago, we were sort of laughing at some of the big McKinsey-type consultancy reports, which were saying battery value was 7-8 years away. Meanwhile, we were quietly and secretly preparing our enhanced frequency response tender, which brought 200 megawatts of batteries onto the UK grid the next year. So technology is moving incredibly quickly. The next breaks on that will all be EVs and consumers, but you know that. So we take all of that and then we run an extensive engagement process with industry to develop a wide range of future scenarios as to how those connections, consumer behaviour, everything else evolves. We develop that into a set of capability requirements for the network or for the grid. How much do we roughly need in each area under each of those scenarios? And then the NOAA process, the Network Options Assessment, tells us, makes those trade-offs and decides which actions and choices we should make in order to deliver adequate capability for the future, meeting those requirements of security, quality of supply and economic efficiency. And probably the single largest important aspect to bear in mind is that this is an annual process. So we are only making a 1-year choice as to what to take forward for the next year. Do I take forward the development of the new lines for Hinkley C? Do I take forward a really cool smart control scheme which will help deliver additional capability to the south coast? Do I invest in some distributed voltage control equipment around the Mersey Ring? Do I stimulate a market in southern Scotland for the control of demand and for flywheels to help inertia? On a 1-year basis. Yeah? And then at the point where you're committing to the delivery of that, then you're committing to the, to the full capital for an overhead line or the full commitment to contract for a smart control system. It's making sense? 1 year at a time. Okay. In more detail, how we're making those choices at the moment. We collect all of the scenario data from FES, which is at a national level, and then we permutate that into some regional sensitivities where you've got particularly complex issues such as very significant growth in offshore wind and interconnection in East Anglia. We identify the requirements and publish those in the 10-year statement. And then we gather from the TOs, from ourselves, from others, a whole variety of options that could deliver some or all of that capability. So we then run that through a very large set of cost-benefit studies that look at how the aggregate of those options individually and jointly are built up to deliver efficient outcomes over the coming 15-year period. So to use a very simple example, you start in Scotland and you've got a lot of wind up there, you might have 25 different combinations of investments which will give you some or all of the capability that you need for each 5-year period. So you then permutate the optimality of that as to which ones you should do, which timing you should take them forward in, how many you should take forward for a coming year to hold an option open. We run at about, look at marketing, about 80 to 90 options, big options across the UK network at the moment. Traditionally it's been very asset based. I'll touch on it now. We're getting much more now into very significant smart control options, which are great for this process because they're cheap and quick to deliver, and actually they're a very cheap option to hold for additional capability. They might in some cases be more expensive in the long term, but often they're cheapest overall. So we do all of that. We select based on least worst regrets and a whole range of scenarios, and then we publish that all out to industry. And the TOs don't have a formal obligation to then enact what we've asked them to invest in, but they would look pretty silly if they didn't, I think is the political and emotional position we're in from a regulatory perspective. In terms of a little bit more detail on how we do that optimality modelling, we put all those options into our bid-free constraint model, which runs all of those options through in different combinations. And what you get out of the back end is effectively a set of critical paths or investment paths that you're following. So it'll say, look, you should do this investment now, and then in 2 years' time that investment, or this combination of investments over the next 5 years, which will then get your capability to this point, and then take it forward from there. And for many of the choices we're making, you will hold an option open, say for 2 or 3 years of development, and then you'll decide to commit to the full contract or capital costs of it, which may then be another 1 to 2 years or 3 to 4 years if it's very large to deliver that. So you're developing and holding an option in standard trading risk, and then you're making a final decision to go with it. Okay. There's a lot more detail on how you'll have had other presentations on similar things, is my guess, in terms of how you might model congestion on a power grid. So I don't intend to talk about that today. But it does model full year with everything in there. And yes, some of this is really hard to model, isn't it? So there's lots of assumptions around how you do things like hydro and storage. One of the big challenges we face in GB is that if you go back 10, 15 years, probably we were thermally constrained 80% of the time, and voltage was an interesting thing which was starting to emerge. We're probably now thermally constrained 30% of the time, voltage constrained 30% of the time, and inertially and stability constrained 30% of the time on the major boundaries. That's too much of a generalization if you look over the next 10 years, but inertial and voltage constraints are as much an issue as thermal. So if you're thinking mainly that you can simplify this problem just by doing thermal flows, then we'll send you away to do more work. And that's what effectively I've explained that on the flow diagram already, that we get that input from our modeling analysis. You're effective. You could think normally your big long-term capital investment option is your expensive option when you look at it, because you've got a lot of uncertainty and you're going to have to go nap on a big capital spend very early in that scheme. Yeah? So if you're looking at Hinkley C, for example, you're making a £700 million decision 6 years out. So you can hedge it for consumers because you get the generator to underwrite the cost, but you still don't want to get it wrong. So if you can do something with intertripping or smart control, so you might be able to get 500 megawatts of network capability on smart control for something under a £3 million initial investment, and then maybe £2 or £3 million a year to operate it. £3 million will barely get you 6 months of stakeholder engagement on a new overhead line, let alone even start designing and building it. So a new overhead line will be sitting in the hundreds of millions of pounds for anything more than a few kilometres. So they're really binary in terms of these choices we're making. So we look at all of that really with the capital cost of a major investment being the backstop test. We look at regret and timing analysis. Should we do it now? Should we do it later? Is it interesting? Does it look invalid because other options are better? We engage with a whole range of our stakeholders on the outputs, and then we have, because no model or maths is perfect, we have, sorry, I can't believe I just said that in this room. But because no maths or model is perfect, we have then a NOAA committee, which is not a star council, but it's a public meeting of the ESO senior electricity team, the senior sort of investment team chaired by myself, that reviews the outputs of all of that modelling and looks at the marginal cases to say, how are we making choices and are those good? It's been really interesting because I think probably, Mark, when we thought that was going to be quite mechanical. We found ourselves putting a lot of attention probably into 3 areas. The first one is big trade-offs between where regionally you've got a lot of complex investment, and actually a clever smart control scheme might just allow you to de-risk it for 5 years until the generation starts coming on. So you can then really see what you're doing, and it loosens the network up and allows you to make better longer-term investment choices that will underpin security. And probably you'll keep using the smart control scheme as well. The second area where it's really come out is that obviously we've got 4 big scenarios that sit, background scenarios for generation, that underpin then the scenario modelling that we do. And you can get marginal choices between years and marginal choice between years of modelling, so our 16 model versus 17. And you can get marginal choices between those scenarios that effectively throw up quirks such as, flow biasing down the east of the country and flow biasing down the west of the country, and one model might actually give you some very odd investment decisions. Within the output of the model, we can pull that out and test it, and then make a human choice, a trade-off as to which one to do. And then the third one is, for some of the major schemes where you're making a big long-term consenting decision, you're not really making a 1-year decision. You don't want to go out to the good people of East Anglia and talk to them about building a massive overhead line within 5 miles of their home or 10 miles of their home or near to the park that they like, without knowing that you're very confident that that is a robust case that you will want to take forward and engage with them in a continuous process for a number of years, because the costs of starting and stopping that process would be very high, not economically, but in terms of public confidence and trust in the process. So for those decisions, we look very carefully not at just the economic optionality of the decision we made that year, but whether we think that decision will endure longer term, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's well within the economic envelope. It just means that against the big parameters that are going to move, can you link it clearly to what they are? So you might be happy just to say, this overhead line is needed for this massive wind farm. Yeah, and if you can say that and the two are both going forwards, then you would go forwards. Because then there's a way of showing that it's very clearly being driven by a particular case. Where it isn't, we would invest more, we would take it more within the envelope, and we'd have to be much more comfortable it was needed across a range of scenarios. We finalised that and we published that after that, and the last one went out end of January. It's about 70, 80 pages, very detailed work and reporting. I don't think we published the spreadsheets and models behind it, do we? Okay, no. But you can look at that at your leisure. I find that between when we start really looking at the results between December and the middle of January, every one of these investment choices has a 4-letter code, and I have to speak in 4-letter codes for a large proportion of that period, and that's with 80 or 90 choices. Where we go, I'll touch on it on the next slide, is that in the future this optimization model with 4 scenarios, regional sensitivities, and that very wide range of scenarios, we are likely to probably times by a factor of 5 or 10 the number of options that we're throwing at it. So this is not a linear, simple optimization. This is not a simple least worst regrets analysis to do. There's already a lot of complex maths in the model and how we do it at the moment. That for us gets a lot harder, and we still want to make sure we do it very well. I've touched on the output already. Skip the slide forward. But this is the sort of thing you're seeing. So for each of these 4-letter words is a particular strategy, investment, or delivery of capability. We'll look at which time or whether it's needed under each of our 4 main scenarios, and then that output then delivers a final decision for that for each capability option that we've got. And that decision can be proceed for a coming year. It can be we want to push that back for a few years. You can hold it as an option, i.e. do nothing, but please don't kill the project. You can stop it completely because you don't need it and you've got something better. Or obviously if it's a new one, you can decide not to start it. Alongside that, we also have a bunch of other analysis that deals with optimum interconnection to the rest of Europe, and throws out the big pieces of work which would then be tendered out under onshore competition. This, to give you a feel of the numbers, so we're looking over about a 10-year horizon typically. Actually, the numbers are relatively small for taking forward work because it's pre-construction. So we're making a decision to proceed on about £20 million of expenditure through 22 options, but the delivery of that work in total would be 3.24 billion if you took it all through to final capital delivery. So it is an awful lot of money over a sort of decadal type cycle. Okay, and I've just overrun by a couple of minutes from what I wanted to say because I was trying to use up half the time, Andy. So look, just to take you right back to the beginning, I'll talk about why it's relevant and then what we're going to do in the future. We're really proud of this because we're not making simple binary choices on a very regional level. And we can't do that in the UK because vast amounts of the new connection is wind coming on remotely and then being laid across a system that was not built to take wind remotely. It's messy, it gets really messy around the old coal fields. And we're trying to make big choices as to whether we should do parallel offshore big HVDC links, or whether incremental upgrades of the onshore system would work, whether we do one big thing for 5 years' time, or we do either smart control or asset, or whether we do small incremental things which are more complex on lots of bits of the network. And we're doing that with such a wide envelope of uncertainty that you can't, the days of a couple of very experienced engineers being able to look at this and going, well, probably we need another 500 megawatts across that boundary, are gone. We're well beyond the ability of a human to encapsulate this and judge in any kind of effectiveness what we're doing. And the bit that is in here, which is absolutely vital, I know Goran will have touched on this morning, is that, you know, we see, and we're very lucky in the UK in that peak demand really hasn't grown, and in fact has shrunk a little within the envelope. So we see an absolutely fabulous opportunity through this process to deliver vast amounts of very sophisticated but very secure, flexible options onto the network to de-risk and give ourselves some very cheap options to manage an awful lot of uncertainty, rather than seeing this process as some kind of great drum which is just going to bang huge investments out every year for the TOs to then go and build. And the main way that we will do that, the main way we will deliver that flexibility and that lower cost for consumers, both across transmission and distribution, because we're bringing distribution into it as well, is for this tool to be very effective and this process to be very effective. It's a boring name, but it's really exciting for us, yeah. And these are the changes that are coming through. So we already run sort of full-bore analysis of what the system is doing. This year we are also bringing the DNOs, we've brought the DNOs into the process so they deliver voltage control options for us alongside transmission infrastructure, both from the TOs and from third-party providers. And we've got a growing number of commercial and market solutions. So commercial solution might be a sort of pretty standard inter-tripping or smart control scheme backed by contracts and delivery of control assets onto the network. A market solution can be something much more sophisticated where you're developing some kind of regional market approach to manage a variety of uncertainties into the future. And the great thing about markets is that they tend to be, if you get them right, they give you an awful lot of flexibility to manage different uncertainty scenarios. Assets don't tend to do that so well. And everyone can play. TOs, the SO developing our own solutions, DNOs, and a whole variety of market participants, from storage to people with spare flywheels or SVCs, synchronous condensers. Anyone can have a go at this, yeah? But part of our challenge for the next step is bringing some coherence to that bidding process. So that's it. I'll stop there.
I may have told you, Duncan, we have a discussant, or
yes,
a nemesis, who's Amy Wilson, and she's going to ask you one question, I think, and we'll have some general discussion for Amy.
Thanks for the talk, very interesting. I guess I'm a statistician, so I'm going to ask you a question about probability.
I might look at it. Yeah, go on.
So you talk about least worst regret and using that to make decisions.
Yes.
Has there ever been an appetite to move away from this sort of scenario-based, more objective way of deciding things towards a more probabilistic approach, assigning probabilities to scenarios? And if not, what do you think it is that's stopping that from happening?
Yeah, there is, I think, because that NOAA committee that sits at the end, that's kind of what we're doing in some ways. And when we do, so although we've got the 4 big scenarios, we do an awful lot of regional sensitivities for the really gnarly problems. And if you look at them again, effectively, as the title of the talk is, what we're doing is making choices, and those choices are really around weighing up probability and risk. So I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that, but I mean, it would be lovely to do. I think the thing is that, although at one level this is relatively simple, to try and engage a stakeholder and because obviously the regulator has to approve this process, it can't just be a black box which no one understands. So our challenge is, how do we introduce the sophistication that you'd get from different approaches, but without just losing the confidence probably of the 1,000 people and participants that are involved in it. And that's even more important going forward. I actually probably, going forward, I care less about the regulatory funding. Sorry, I'm just subconsciously pointing at Andrew. I care less about the regulatory funding. I probably care more about the fact that once this is significantly underpinning market participation, explaining how your market requirements are generated is a very, very tough conversation to have with a whole set of investors and project financiers, because the first question they ask is, well, how do I understand what choices you're making, and how do you give me confidence that this is stable year on year, and that I'm not just going to invest in this market one year and then, we've tweaked a couple of our equations, and you know, I don't need your £800 million of investment that you're making in the UK anymore, is a much harder conversation. So, yes, it would be amazing, but the ask would be, how do we make that simple, transparent, and explainable in some way, which can be with historic data and backcast analysis rather than making the model simple. Yeah, it's about confidence.
Quite a few questions. I think Claudia had a question.
Yeah, can you put please the slide 9?
Wow.
Well, I saw there is a number.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. But
Yes.
Before the question, a comment. It is very good that mathematical models are imperfect, because otherwise we will be out of business.
Good. I'm pleased you like that too.
They need to be meaningful. Okay. So what drew my attention in this slide is the word retire. Because some years ago in capacity expansion you can add or you can also eliminate lines.
Yes.
Some years ago in Brazil we proposed a model for doing the expansion, taking out some lines because sometimes it's better to increase the capacity. And we were told, no way, because this means that we were misusing the taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
Do you have many lines? Do you retire many lines in your plans?
No, but there's two things to it. So we have, I remember the first, so David Wright runs the TO business for National Grid, and I remember saying to him a few years ago, this is quite a techie point, I don't think you need that capacitor at Thorpe Marsh anymore. And I might as well have told him that his children were ugly. It's the antithesis of what asset-led businesses are used to thinking about. But it was the right question, because actually, one of the untalked about things of the last 10 years is that the demand for voltage support equipment in terms of holding voltage up on the network has gone away completely. You barely need it because you need to push the voltage up for things that heat up or rotate. And pretty much all the stuff that used to heat up and rotate on the grid has gone. TV, cathode ray tubes, directly driven AC pumps. There aren't that many left. And so, yes, there are assets on the system which aren't needed anymore. Lines, I've thought about this quite a lot, because I think the most valuable asset held by any transmission company in a relatively urbanized environment like the UK, the most valuable asset the company holds is the consent to have a line across the public space. It is not the value of it; it is the consent to have that line. And actually, if you look at the underpinning activity of a transmission business, a lot of the effort goes into seeking consent for a new line, and most of the risk sits in there. And actually, I think we have in National Grid TO something like 45,000 contracts for wayleaves and other things, which has a team of 70 people managing it, to maintain the consent and permissions and payments. So yes, we do look at line retiral. Bradwell Oldbury 132 is a retired transmission line which has been transferred back to distribution, but they didn't want it. So that's in the process of being dismantled. I think is the only one in the UK. But retiral is a one-way street. So I think it is economically correct to only do it as a last resort, because the most valuable thing you have is the consent to have that there in the first place.
Martina.
Well, I got a quick one. So in Germany, there is a problem with the grid, in the meaning that grid fees on the final customers' bills are very, very high in rural regions, less densely populated regions, versus very highly densely populated regions. And they fight to homogenize a little bit this gap. Do you have a similar problem here, or?
We have two things. We do have, specifically for the north of Scotland, there is something called the hydro benefit. I don't know if Andrew knows about this, where an amount of money is paid to underwrite the original cost of the construction of that network, to effectively to reduce bills in that area. More broadly, yes, we went and had a very good look at Germany a few years ago, and the issues of the charging death spiral, where costs increase and therefore people try and remove more and more demand from the network in order to reduce their costs. The fundamental reasons for the current charging reviews in the UK is largely to avoid that, not to avoid that charging death spiral, but to effectively manage the you know, the passing of costs effectively onto communities and participants in the market in a fair and reasonable way.
Chris Dunn, University of Edinburgh now.
Hi, Chris. Yeah.
I mean, it's quite a general question of what's where you would most like to see ideas or support coming out of the mathematical sciences community. And I guess one might divide that into two questions of what you think we might be able to help with immediately, and on a sort of 3 to 5 year timeline, what kind of areas you'd like us to be thinking about and providing things that you can implement in maybe 2022, 2025.
Yeah, can I take 3? We put this one up because this is our most interesting, immediate, large-scale problem that we face, which is running at billions of pounds underneath it, and will run more in the future. So the ability to figure out how to optimize these kind of choices well and use effective models to do that is, because we feel we're pretty much at the limit of what the existing process can either handle computationally or can really handle, you know, with high quality outcomes and analysis. The 2 others I'd give you is that, and we've touched on this in some of the conversations we've had, John. One is that the electricity grid is quite correctly described as a single machine, and if Keith Bell isn't here, but if Keith always trots out the line that it's the most complex machine ever built by human beings. The real advantage we have at the moment, or historically, is that was a machine with basically 200 subcontrollers on it and 1 main controller. And the subcontroller was, the main controller is the ESO, and the subcontrollers was the regulation of each of the 200 generating units on that grid. That machine, that grid, is rapidly moving to one in which there will be many, many thousands, if not millions, of independent or in some way optimized controllers working on that grid in some way at the same time. Many of them may be aggregated by an aggregator or other participating agency. We see lots of uncertainties around how a many controller system will function and work. And our best example of how this doesn't work at the moment is the flash crashes that you see in high frequency trading, where you get an asymptotic outcome from all of these fast trading actions competing with each other. We see high levels of similarity between the evolution of high frequency trading in financial products and the potential for high volume and relatively short notice trading in power grids by many, many controllers. And we absolutely cannot have flash crashes. So there are some very simple rules that we could put in place to help manage any asymptotic effects, but the more rules we put in place, the less efficient the market will be in trading. So, and then just simplify every algorithm we've got would be great. That's the number 3.
Yes.
Yeah. One of your first slides was about incentive to under and overinvestment. An obvious incentive for you is to overinvest because it makes your life easier and also gets you regulatory revenues. So what's the regulatory mechanism to stop you overinvesting?
Doesn't get me any regulatory revenues. Because I'm the ESO, I'm separate SO. Yeah?
But it makes your life easier still.
That's a suggestion to that.
Yeah, it is, and that's why I'm quite open about the fact that.
Mechanism to stop you doing.
But there's several things. So, one, I run that bureaucracy. So my first choice is to run it effectively, yeah, and to be conscious of it, because this is an engineering set of choices that, as it's described historically. And engineers will bias to low risk, but actually the tension, it's like any organization, not just a regulated industry, but so I used to work in pharmaceuticals, yeah? If you go and ask a production plant owner within a pharmaceutical company like Glaxo or Pfizer or anything, what they want, they will de-risk all of their manufacturing process control because they don't want hassle, and it'll give them more consistent performance and get rid of a whole lot of problems. But all of that de-risking adds cost into their construction and ongoing operation cost. And it's exactly the same here. You always come down to the fact that on the one hand you have an easy life that costs more money, and on the other hand you have a harder life that costs less money. Okay? And the challenge here is to strike that balance, as in everything in life. So I don't see the incentives that I face as the ESO as any different to the pressures that are on any other business transaction. But the way that we build confidence in it is by being very transparent around the process we're using. And unless we can explain these things simply, people will lose confidence because they'll assume even we will bias to overinvestment.
Ian, you had a question?
Yeah, Ben Hobbs from Johns Hopkins and the California ISO. So there are a number of geeky people here. We like to evaluate real options, and this is what you do. Terrific talk. And I just wanted to ask a kind of a techie question about how you actually evaluate them. So one way is with your production costing model, bid free, right?
Yeah.
You assume over time acquisition of options, and then okay, year 5, and this scenario happens, and we exercise it, and so you get one trace over 20 or 40 years of the costs, and you do that for all combinations of the options and their exercise and the scenarios. So you have these thousands of combinations and runs we do with bid free, and you can assemble it into a big decision tree, I suppose.
That is what we do, yep.
Okay. So an option that some of us like to use here, John Paul Watson in the last row, Harry Van der Velde of Edinburgh, Gordon was here earlier. Daniel Pozo still here? Yes. A number of us build a single optimization model with production costing and choosing the options and contingency dependent exercise of them. Necessarily much simpler than bid free, but it can account for things like where might generators build in response to our network reinforcements, allowing that to be endogenous, and then accounting for the interactions of these things maybe much more quickly than running thousands of scenarios and putting them in a decision tree. I'm wondering if any thought has been given to this sort of stochastic programming approach to real options analysis at a system level, or we'll just have fun in academia doing that, I suppose.
Mark, do you want to? Can I bring Mark in? I've got Mark in here. Go on, Mark.
So, yes, that would be really good. The problem that we have is the generation is determined by where the market wants it to be. So we can't actually consider that. We almost have to adapt to that. So bringing that all together would be good. It's something that we've been discussing with the regulator actually, which is option values. Because at the moment it's a regret, it's not an actual intrinsic value on that combination of options. So it's a bit of a watch this space, and if you guys do have anything that we might be able to use for this process, we'd be very open for that.
There are many of us, I'm sure, would like to share that information with you.
Yeah.
And then a quick follow-up. So the min-max regret, decision theorists have all sorts of issues with that. Does that give you very different decisions than if you just minimized probability-weighted cost, or minimized the worst cost as opposed to the worst regret?
No, I don't. Not massively, I don't think. Does it? There's some timing issues, but
okay.
Depends on the scenarios you choose, Ben.
Okay, I'm done.
David, last comment.
Yes, so one of the key issues is obviously where the generation is going to locate.
yes.
So how much are you thinking about the price signals that you're going to give for the transmission network, and how confident are you in those kinds of predictions?
We think about them very carefully, because obviously, so the classic example is, we've got a first parallel HVDC link operating in the UK now between running from Glasgow down to Liverpool, and when that came online, the cost of that was then pushed into the transmission charges levied in Scotland. So we knew that when that came on, that those charges were going to go up. So we've watched that quite carefully. But what we know is that actually, as I said, most of the remote choices around generation location are being driven by renewables, and they are locating there because, the wind factor in northern Scotland is 40%, 45%, 50% on Shetland, and obviously offshore on the east coast it's sitting between 45 and 55%. So they're really the dominating variable within the investment choices they're making are, one, the consenting space that they have in the marine environment, and then secondly, the location of the turbines within that. And then basically they're looking to us to deliver the the asset, whatever it costs. They don't really care. So the long-term pricing is not really driving that. Separately, there's a very interesting longer conversation about how you might evolve that for very small participants and highly distributed participants in the future. We see an awful lot of big fans of locational marginal pricing around the world. We really struggle with that in the UK. I do. I'll have the fight now. Just because as we look at the grid in the future, we see a massive excess of flexibility versus that which will be needed by the market. And LMPs are great at providing signals where you have less capability than you might need, and therefore you're effectively going to draw on a lot of it. Our experience with triads, which is effectively a mandated price signal to the market, is that once your flexibility starts to grow beyond that which you need, it's a very unstable system. And actually you need to have a proper traded market in order to establish some kind of price-use equilibrium.
Stan, I think, is dying to ask a question. So
Well, I think we should have a ticketing system. Otherwise, who can hold his hand up for long? You did say at an early stage that the constraints you experience across your major boundaries on the network
Yeah.
are once upon a time they were mostly thermal.
Yes.
They're now roughly divided between thermal and frequency response. And
Volts and stability, yeah.
so how much is this a question of not having quite caught up yet on the great change that's taken place in the nature of the inputs network? In other words, would it be a relatively small task to get rid of those latter constraints that crept in recently,
No,
as
I don't.
opposed to costs of reinforcing the network in terms of thermal capacity? In which are these really significant constraints in the future as well?
Well, all of them, yes, they are. Have I got? It's like a 3-minute answer, probably, Andy. So we introduced a policy called Connect and Manage in the UK around 2010, which basically said, we don't know what's going to happen. Just get people on as much as you can, avoiding market power issues, and invest in the transmission infrastructure behind it as much as you can. It's completely unlocked renewables growth in the UK, particularly in Scotland. And now it's doing good work on solar in the south as well. But it does mean that you end up with a lot of eggs in one basket, which is can your network upgrades come on time? We're still chasing that between Scotland and England because the Western HVDC is 2 to 3 years later than it was originally meant to be, and the Eastern HVDCs have now become very, very important, the next upgrades, because of effectively the way that the planning and consenting process has played out means that most of the wind is in Scotland, and therefore we could quite happily take another 4 gigawatts of transfer capacity into Scotland. It's already grown from 2 to 6 in the last 15 years. So we're still chasing that. The underlying level of constraints on the network at the moment is about 300 million. That is 200 million more than I would like it to be in the long term. I think the natural level of constraints in a steady state GB market, even with a lot of renewables on it, is probably between 80 and 150 million, give or take 30 million or so. I don't have the maths to prove that. That's just a feel based on what we look at as optimal.
Catch-up still to happen.
Pardon?
You seem to think there's a little bit of catch-up still.
Yeah, there is still some catch-up, mainly because the assets have been delayed. And we're mitigating some of that with smart control. The voltage constraints, we are chasing a massive decline in reactive power consumption in the UK, which is seen certainly across Europe. We've discussed it extensively at a European level. And that is a combination of, the network's used very differently, so we switch out about 30% of the network overnight in the summer. Beaulieu-Denny, which is a very famous £600 million line, 450 million for the basic asset, built between the north of Scotland and the centre of Scotland to transport all that renewable energy. Beaulieu-Denny is only in service about 30% of the time, because we only switch it in when we need it for wind. The rest of the time we switch it out because it's 200 to 300 megavars of gain on a very lightly loaded system, and we can't keep the volts down. So the network is not this iron, this sort of single iron grid which sits and is used in the same way all the time anymore. We're flipping circuits in and out. I could take a flow south circuit out, a north south circuit out. I could take one of those out for 6 months over the summer. You wouldn't notice. Easy. So those tensions and pressures have changed a lot as to how we manage it, but chasing voltage, chasing stability down are the next tasks.
Okay, now I think it's a very good point to stop. We have to break for lunch now, so great talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you.